It's the midterms and it's happening later this year, but long before that, we actually have a spate of primary elections happening around the country. Today, there's going to be elections going on in Arizona, which we're going to be covering live a little bit later on today, but it is happening pretty much everywhere, and it is very good to see. If you want progress in this country, inside of the Democratic Party in particular, you get it basically through primaries. And one that we're gonna focus on today is in New York, where the governor's race just got a lot more exciting with the recent entry into the race of Cynthia Nixon. Joining the show now to talk about that, Nomiki Konst, reporter for 2IT Politics. Welcome to the show, Nomi.
Well, hello.
Good to have you here, and you are just about the perfect person to get us up to speed on this particular race. So for those
Why would you say that? Is it anything to do with my obsession with New York State politics at all?
With New York, with the governor in particular, with all of that, yes. And obviously I know that you follow primaries very closely. So for those who might only know Cynthia Nixon perhaps from Sex and the City or from some of her other work, who might not know about her history, who is she? In a political context, where is she coming from?
So, of course, Cynthia Nixon is a well-known actor. She almost has an EGOT. I think she's missing the Oscar, if I recall. But aside from that, Cynthia Nixon has been well-known in the grassroots activist community in New York for almost 3 decades at this point. She started off in the 90s fighting for equitable education because her kids were going through public schools, and she realized that public schools in New York, believe it or not, are not receiving the amount of funding that the Supreme Court has actually ruled for them to receive. And this is specifically now under Governor Cuomo. So Cynthia Nixon, she became a spokesperson for Alliance for Quality Education and got involved in many other issues afterwards, and went out there and stumped for Mayor de Blasio. Very well known, having worked for him tirelessly on his campaign. She's very progressive. She's been arrested at City Hall, chained to City Hall, with friends of mine who came up to me when she announced and said, she'll never remember me, but 20 years ago, I was arrested next to her at City Hall, and I just think she's so badass. So I think people realize that now, but when she initially announced, a lot of people were like, oh, another actor, another famous person. But the way that she's pushed back against Cuomo, it's become very clear that Cynthia Nixon is her own person. She has her own opinions. And she even married her wife, who she met, fighting for quality education. Protesting.
I hadn't actually known about the arrest. Do we want a criminal as governor of New York? I'm a little bit worried now.
This is New York.
So you've talked about
types of criminals, though.
That's true. Yeah, some have changed the laws, so they're no longer criminals. So look, you rightfully point out her political activism. Obviously, some of these issues are, they're the biggest issues in New York and around the country that she's been involved in. One of the chief charges against her is that she hasn't held elected office, and some people are trying to draw some sort of comparison between her and Donald Trump. What do you think about those comparisons?
I think that we need to be, and we can be, smarter than this. The truth is, there are plenty of people who've held several elected offices that are perfectly unqualified or do not have rooting in activism. I think what's important about Cynthia Nixon is she's out there, representing the people as somebody who, she grew up in a walk-up, a fourth floor walk-up in New York City. And that couldn't happen today. You just couldn't do that as a single mother. You could not raise a child in a fourth floor walk-up. So when she talks about issues of real estate taking over the city and gentrification and education that is, flat out racist and unconstitutional at this point, that's coming from a place of experience. A lot of politicians out there, not all of them obviously, but there's plenty of politicians who work politics to get into office. And that's great, but does that mean that they're good at what they do? I mean, Andrew Cuomo literally got his first job as a campaign manager on his father's mayoral race.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're dealing with right now. Somebody who only has experience in politics. And when I say politics, I mean lowercase p politics. I'm talking about the strategy. I'm talking about the horse trading, the power brokering, not the issues. And you can see that because Andrew Cuomo, when he talks about certain issues, or recently he got he laid down in a protest with Randy Weingarten. in a suit and tie. This is somebody who's never been in the grassroots. I mean, he has no feeling of what it's like to be with the people because he's never actually worked with the people. He's always used them as a prop or a tool or a pawn on his chessboard.
I don't know, Nomi, if he's willing to ruin a suit, I mean, it's probably an expensive suit too. We should bear that in mind.
I think he's got plenty of donors who could cover him for another suit.
So, okay, well, talk to us a little bit about his time. So he is the incumbent. He's had quite a bit of time to get things done in New York. What are the pros? What are the cons about his time as New York's governor?
Well, New York is undeniably more progressive than it was 30 years ago. And even 30 years ago, it was way more progressive. But due to gerrymandering, there was an illusion that New York was a more conservative state, or at least moderate. So it is by far a Democratic state. And there's no more proof than the fact that we've elected an assembly that is overwhelmingly Democratic. Mm-hmm. And we have a Senate that if it weren't for gerrymandering would be controlled by Democrats. But either way, we elected it to be controlled by Democrats, and Governor Cuomo was at the table during the origination, literally, I think a week after he was elected governor the first time around, of this thing called the Independent Democratic Conference. And that's the IDC that we've been reporting on. It has existed since for almost 8 years now. And their job is literally to go around and pretend that they're Democrats and get elected as Democrats, but they end up blocking legislation, and they have been conferencing with the Republicans. They've rejoined the Democrats now that Cynthia Nixon has pushed Governor Cuomo to ask them to rejoin. But the truth is that this state mm-hmm. could be passing sweeping legislation, everything from campaign finance reform to Medicare for all to being a sanctuary state to codifying Roe v. Wade. I mean, there's literally a list of like 150 pieces of legislation that have not gone through because of the IDC. And who does that benefit? That benefits Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo can pick and choose what legislation he wants to pass, and it's usually watered down. Like, for instance, he championed his free college legislation, but it turned out when you looked at the details, it only affects a small percentage of people in New York who could possibly already afford to go to state schools.
Interesting. Okay, so it sounds good, but once you actually look at the numbers, perhaps not so much. Nomi, the race, she's been in the race now for several weeks at the very least, and I've noticed his name, Andrew Cuomo's name, popping up in the news for all of these big new proposals. Why is it that he's so active all of a sudden?
So Andrew Cuomo, if you recall, he was primaried by Zephyr Teachout, who mm-hmm. is an attorney. She's an anti-corruption expert. She's she endorsed and supported Bernie Sanders in the 2016 election. The funny thing about that race, which she did very well in, where she announced late in the game, didn't have the WFP, the Working Families Party line, or any union support, he didn't acknowledge her. He didn't even acknowledge her. They were at a parade. And there's this amazing footage, if you want to look this up, it's really funny, where she was trying to shake his hand, and like his handlers and his like aide, who's now going to prison, were all pushing her aside. And he would just turn his face like this and pretend that he didn't know her. And Zephyr's like, hey, I'd like to, nope, didn't happen. So what's amazing about 4 years later is you can't ignore Cynthia Nixon. I mean, Cynthia Nixon coughs, and she's, she has a news article about her. She can get on shows like Stephen Colbert and Wendy Williams, and she can get on TV whenever she wants. So it's a good pushback against his $31 million war chest in which he can get his own message out. So he's forced to respond. So the other day, for instance, or yesterday, there was a protest in Albany. It was a march called Walk the Walk about climate change, because Andrew Cuomo says he's, for climate reform and did the whole international mayor's thing with himself as a governor. But the truth is that he does very little. He continues to support forms of fracking, accepting fracked gas. He banned fracking in the state, but really he's done very little. And while this protest was going on, while Cynthia Nixon was there, he issued a ban on plastic bags. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's going to save the environment. So he does these things where she will say, I'm for this, or she'll literally be in the middle of a speech and he'll issue a statement saying, all right, I am for the legislation that passes blah, blah, blah. And the truth is that it's still smoke and mirrors, because you have to go through the legislative process, and of course, the Democrats don't control the state the legislature right now. So he's the master of illusion, and that's what's really important to keep in mind is that everything Andrew Cuomo does is for a headline, and he's going to try to use Cynthia Nixon's progressiveness as a vehicle to say, I listened and I passed all these different things, or I championed all these different things, but the proof is in the pudding. He's really done very little as a Democrat, as a progressive. And I would even compare his record to Chris Christie, and it would be very similar, if not at some moments. I think Chris Christie actually was a little bit more progressive on some issues.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, so you talked about how she can get on TV. She's getting all this press coverage. So overall, we're through the first phase of her entry into the primary. In terms of the Democratic Party and the media, what has the reception been?
So what's amazing about Andrew Cuomo is that while he controls the chessboard, right? He pretty much owns the New York State Democratic Party. It's very similarly structured to the DNC. You've got an executive committee and you've got members. He overwhelmingly controls those members. But this is a man who's gone to war with a lot of people and has a lot of enemies. Kirsten Gillibrand notably endorsed him immediately after Cynthia Nixon announced her candidacy. But the history of Kirsten Gillibrand and Governor Cuomo is not great. So there was clearly some sort of favor happening there. You see that Senator Schumer's been quiet, that Bill de Blasio definitely voices his concern about Andrew Cuomo on a daily basis. You have the Senate leader, the Democratic leader, said she's staying out of the race. Those who say they're staying out, it's even more powerful. Mm-hmm. He's made a lot of enemies. And, people are frustrated that in the age of Trump, he's allowed the IDC to continue, that he operates from a place of threat. Don't forget, this is a man who has 2 corruption trials this year. His chief aide and some other aides were, but one in particular, Joe Percoco, who he called his third brother. His father said it was his third son. He's likely to go to jail for up to 50 years. And That had to do with a pay-to-play scandal involving the governor. Now, there's another corruption trial starting just in a couple of months that's going to go on during this primary. This is a governor who ran on an anti-corruption campaign, created a Moreland commission on public corruption, then shut it down when they started to look into his office. So
wow. Nomi, we are going to have to end it there, unfortunately. We're running out of time. I wish we had more time. Perhaps we can check back in a little bit later on in the primary season, see how things are going then. But thank you, as always, for joining us and helping break down this issue for us.
Thanks, John. Take care.